Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 8, Lesson 4, The Minority Movement in the 1960s. The African American Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s really leads more minorities to understand that they deserve the same rights as the white people as well. And that's what we're going to look at today. Beginning with the women's liberation movement. Many American women raised their voices in the 1960s to protest their lack of equality to men. And women in this time had to pursue mostly at home, take care of the kids, take care of your husband kind of matters, because that was the traditional women's role. And in the 1950s and 60s, especially after World War II, when we see more women joining the workplace, women have time to pursue employment and their own interests. But yet women are still seen as unequal to men regardless of what they do. And so women were really dissatisfied with this, the women's role as a housewife persona. They believe that they should have equal rights to men. I should be able to go have a job as well as take care of my family and make money and pursue interests of my own. And they're really influenced by the successes of the African American Civil Rights Movement to push for this equality. And they're also led by some really highly educated leaders who helped them to fight for these rights. The goals of the feminist movement are they want to achieve greater economic opportunity. This means that women want to have jobs where they're paid the same as men and can make a living wage. And in order to do this, they form organizations, publish books, protest, and demonstrate to get their point across. And most of these are nonviolent protests that show we are people too. It doesn't matter the gender. And one of the major books that are published is called The Feminine Mystique, and it's written by a lady named Betty Friedan, and it becomes a bestseller. This book really sparks a new movement called feminism. And we hear feminism thrown around all the time in the 21st century, but this is where it begins. And the book describes how women felt unfulfilled depending upon their husbands for everything. And she espouses the ideas of feminism, which means she lays them out. She explains these ideas of this movement. And a survey that was done during the time period shows how unhappy these women are being housewives and performing these normal, traditional gender roles, and leads to more and more people advocating for the rights for women and equality. One of the organizations that's founded is the National Organization for Women, or NOW. And this organization is formed by Friedan, the lady who wrote The Feminine Mystique, and the purpose of this organization is to advocate for equal rights for women using tactics of peaceful protest and nonviolence to get freedom in education, employment, and just in general everyday American life for women. And NOW is still an organization that's very active in the 21st century. The photograph on this slide is from a 21st century march of NOW, and really shows that women can do the same thing as men, and tries to raise awareness for that aspect of their organization. Another very important feminine icon of the era is Gloria Steinem, and she founds a magazine called Miss Magazine that's devoted to women's concerns as opposed to fashion or things like that. It's different from other magazines because it focuses on real important issues that women are facing in the time period. And Gloria Steinem becomes one of the most influential feminists of the 60s and 70s. Out of this era comes even more push for an amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, which many people of the time period see as a very liberal movement. And the purpose of the ERA was to end inequality for women. And this is not beginning in the 1960s. This had actually been going on for several decades prior, but it really gains a lot of strength in the 60s. And unfortunately, the ERA is still being debated in Congress in 2020. By the 1960s, 15 states had not ratified the ERA, and this means that it was 3 states short of the 38 required for ratification into the Constitution. Next, we get to affirmative action. And this is an outcome of the 1960s civil rights movement that was intended to provide equal opportunity for all women and all minorities. And it helps us in the education and employment spheres of influence, where we being women or minorities, deserve equal opportunity, equal rights, equal everything. The whole purpose of affirmative action is to gain equality for women and minorities in education and employment. Women also believe they should have equal pay. And this, again, is something that we're still fighting for in 2020. Feminists want equal job opportunities as well as the same pay for the same job. They don't see that it's fair anymore that a man make more money on average than the woman. So, for example, let's say a man's making $1 an hour, a woman will make 60 cents. And in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed, making it required for all companies to pay women the same wage as men, even though in many industries in 2020, we're still fighting this issue. A major case in women's rights education is Title IX, which is passed in 1972. And it bans discrimination based on gender in education, promoting gender equality and proving that girls have the same opportunities as men. Some things to know about Title IX is that it is a civil right that prohibits sexual discrimination in education. It applies to all students regardless of gender identity. Schools must protect the student who's making the complaint, and retaliation cannot be made against them. Schools have to ensure that no student has to share campus spaces such as dorms, classes, workplaces with anybody who's abusing them. Schools can issue non-contact directives to prevent accused students from approaching or interacting with a victim. Schools must be proactive in ensuring that your campus is free from sexual discrimination. Schools cannot discourage you from continuing your education. All schools receiving federal funding, including public K-12 schools, and majority of colleges are subject to Title IX, and schools must have an established procedure for handling complaints of sexual discrimination, harassment, and violence. And all of those things are protected under the Title IX Act. Next, we move on to Mexican American and Hispanic American rights in LULAC and the GI Forum. In 1929, Mexican Americans formed the League of United American Citizens, also known as LULAC. LULAC sues in Texas on behalf of Fernandez, which was the landmark Supreme Court case in Texas, where the Mexican American gentleman was convicted of murder but had to face an all-white jury, so he was refused his right to a jury of his peers. And LULAC actually sues the state on behalf of him to get that matter taken care of. The American GI Forum was formed to address Mexican Americans who'd served in the military but did not receive their benefits. As we learned in a previous lesson, all American soldiers returning from World War II were offered what we call the GI Bill, which offered funding for education and home loans. But many Mexican Americans were not getting those benefits. And so a gentleman by the name of Hector Garcia, who was a veteran and a doctor, formed this organization to make sure that those Mexican Americans who fought alongside the white soldiers got the same benefits and the same rights that they did. And this brings us to the Chicano Movement. This is a Mexican American-based movement because Mexican Americans were facing huge amounts of discrimination and racism. And so the organization and the movement was formed to gain better working conditions for migrant workers, as well as voting and political rights for those who were citizens. And within the Chicano movement, we see the migrant farm working movement. Led by Cesar Chavez, who was a migrant farm worker himself, who formed the National Farm Workers Association. And the purpose of this organization was to get migrant farm workers better pay and better working conditions for themselves. This is a very similar concept to what labor unions did for workers during the Progressive era, except for this point, it's specifically for Hispanic American migrant workers. And working alongside Cesar Chavez is Dolores Huerta. She's a Mexican American woman who co-founds the United Farm Workers Union, and she helps to lead a national boycott against grapes because these grapes were largely harvested by Mexican American migrant farm workers who were getting paid very little amounts for very long, hard working days. And along with Cesar Chavez, she believes that these people deserve better. This boycott lasts for 5 years and is extremely successful because it gains those opportunities for Hispanic American workers because the grape industry starts to lose money. And they know the only way to prevent them from losing more money is to make sure that they provide what the United Farm Workers is asking for, which is better working conditions and higher pay. And so more on the California grape boycott is these organizations plead with Americans to refuse to buy certain products to make a point. They're peacefully boycotting that product or refusing to purchase it to make a point to those organizations that they need to treat their workers better. Chavez and Huerta, as well as many of their followers, go on hunger strikes as a means of protest. And all of this was for the purpose of fighting for laws to be passed to improve the lives of migrant workers, give them better pay, safer and better working conditions, and they achieve all of that. Next, we have La Raza Unida. This is a Latino political party founded in 1969, also known as the National United People's Party. And the purpose of this party is to promote ethnic pride and back Latino candidates for political office. This also increases the amount of Mexican Americans that are elected to office in the United States, promoting equality within political spaces. Our next version of this movement is the Chicano Mural movement. And it begins in the 60s as a way to really celebrate Mexican American culture and large amounts of these murals can be seen across the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California even. And artists are painting Mexican American themes on schools, government buildings, housing projects, anywhere they can really get a platform. It's a form of civil disobedience because, of course, graffiti is illegal, but it recognized Mexican American heritage and really celebrates that heritage throughout the nation. The last group of people we're going to talk about in this lesson are Native Americans. And throughout the 1960s, Native Americans really strive for equal rights also. They had lost their ancestral lands, they had lost their cultures, they'd been moved off of their reservations, forced to assimilate over centuries in the United States. And in the mid-1900s, the federal government forces many of these Native Americans off of their reservations because they see it as a means of what we call assimilation, or trying to adapt to mainstream culture. At that point, mainstream culture being white man's culture. So living on a reservation was not what white men did. They forced them off of it. And they changed how they looked. So if you look at the photo here, this is the same kids. On the right, they're more Americanized or assimilated. And on the left, they are in their native dress. And this is what we call the Carlisle School way of thinking. The 1960s sees the rise of the American Indian movement, which addresses the plight of American Indians and seeks to empower them. They try to ensure that these people are getting full civil rights and take a lot of their cues and tactics from the militant wing of the African Americans, which means the more violent side, your more Malcolm X, Black Panther Party side versus the nonviolent Martin Luther King Jr. side. In 1973, Wounded Knee, South Dakota, which was a very famous site of major Native American massacres, led an armed occupation of the town. And U.S. military forces surround the town. 2 American Indian activists are killed, and the event raises public awareness and support towards Native Americans because they get to see not only are the Native Americans mourning the loss of those who were killed in the 1890 massacre, but they see the violence that's brought upon them by the military forces in this time period, and they see that these people are still being persecuted against. And it really brings a more public awareness to how these people are being treated. This is going to bring us to the end of Unit 8, Lesson 4, and I hope you have a great day.